Good evening. The best is yet to come, and I'm not referring to the creme brulee with maple sauce on top. Choosing the Lyons Award is an excruciating and wonderful process, as many of you know. It was wonderful because despite all the problems that we're familiar with in our industry, certainly in the United States, we had so many amazing nominations this year. And it was excruciating because trying to choose one from all these extraordinary journalists was quite a challenge. Our nominations included amazing people like Remy Ochlik, a French photographer who died covering the conflict in Syria, João Silva, a photographer of extraordinary talent and courage. We had journalists who were nominated from Somalia, from Iran, from Vietnam, from Cuba, and even from the United States, including Timothy Noah, a US writer who wrote an extraordinary book about income inequality. But many of the fellows felt very strongly that this was an important moment to honor our colleagues in Mexico. As Laura Wides Munoz, one of our fellows, wrote, "As we look to recognize the valiant reporters risking their lives around the world, we have for years been ignoring the work of journalists in our own backyard, who face incredible violence, a violence often committed not by a despotic government, easy to identify, but by roving shadow governments, the narco-traffickers." She went on to talk about the work done by our colleagues in Mexico, and she noted, "They have seen colleagues brutally murdered or forced to flee the country, and yet they continue to believe they can make a difference. They continue to bear witness." I think it's difficult to overstate the crisis in journalism in Mexico today. We all know about the dozens of journalists who have been killed or disappeared. But there's also another problem facing journalists who are trying to really report the truth, which is they sometimes don't get protection from their own news organizations. Journalists who are honest and trying to do good reporting sometimes face the issue of colleagues in their own newsrooms who've been corrupted by the narcos and perhaps are sending information about what they're doing to someone who would do the mill. And in Mexico, traditionally, one of the main sources of revenue for news organizations has been government advertising. And I heard so many stories when I was recently in Mexico on vacation about local or perhaps national politicians who didn't hesitate to use the threat of withdrawing advertising as a means to pressure owners. And it was pretty remarkable to me when I was in Mexico that so much of the dramatic narco news was consigned to page 2 or 4 or 6 and just didn't seem to make the front page. When we reached out to our colleagues in Mexico or people who knew about Mexico to ask them who would be a journalist who could sort of represent the best qualities of the Mexican press, journalists who were brave, who were honest, who were willing to really risk everything to tell these stories, it was really striking how many people in Mexico and how many people who were experts on journalism in Latin America came back to us with one name, and that was Marcela Turati, a woman who we didn't know, actually. Among the things they told us was that she was one of the few journalists in Mexico that still traveled to those really violent areas where drug violence was tearing communities apart. She had really distinguished herself by not just covering narcos or repeating the government characterization that these were sort of bad guys fighting bad guys, but in fact, really chronicling the horrendous damage done to these communities and the many victims who were not bad guys. And one more thing that really sets her apart Mexican journalism, unfortunately, has had a long history of divisions among journalists. There hasn't really been a lot of solidarity. So she created a group, as you know, called Periodistas de a Pie, which goes into the provinces, provides training, and to journalists who get little or no training, help teach them things like how to protect themselves as best they could. This is really an extraordinary thing. You all have met, or many of you at least, have met Marcela. She just has an extraordinary story. Very briefly, she worked for the newspaper Reforma, which was really one of the papers that was symbolic of the new democracy. She worked there from 1998 to 2003. And at the beginning of 2004, she took her savings and she wanted to go on a trip around Latin America. And she spent 2 years visiting newsrooms, talking to journalists, taking courses, doing reporting. And the question she had when she was traveling was, could journalism bring change? And she came back to Mexico, and using some of the notes from her trip, she created a blog and a discussion group. And it was called Periodismo de Esperanza, Journalism of Hope. I think it's hard for many of us to appreciate the difficulty of working under the conditions that she works, and living in a country where the reality right now is just so difficult. She's written or worked on a few books and done a lot of outstanding journalism, but one of the ones that I think is the most touching is her latest book, which she and another journalist put together, which is a collection of stories from around the country, and really to a country where I think a country that has just grown so dark, I feel. I mean, where just hope is so in short supply. The book is about Mexicans who have tried to fight back and tried to not to stand up for their communities, or to not have that unfortunate pattern that we've seen of organized crime taking over states. And it's called Amid the Ashes, Stories of Life in Times of Death. On behalf of the Nieman Fellows of the class of 2013, I just could not be more delighted to present this award to Marcela, the Lyons Award for Conscience and Integrity in Journalism. It's just so well deserved.